And good morning again. This is Don Browne from LaBelle, Florida, and doing our weekly morning conversation about balance and health in general. And we have been talking in past weeks about we started on Dr. Mao's latest book on the five element personality theory and things you would do to keep yourself balanced using the tips that he's used, as well as his father, Master Ni. And then we moved on to Dr. Nancy SantoPietro's book on Feng Shui and health, and how you can modify your environment to help your health and finances and relationships. And the basis of that idea of Feng Shui is to pay attention to your environment, which would be your house, your neighborhood, your room, and try to modify the various things in your environment to be more in balance with nature and your own personality. And in the tradition of Feng Shui, you have a little map of your surroundings, which gives eight different directions in the room based on the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. And in the center is the ninth category, which is your health in general. So you're surrounded by the four, or actually eight different directions around your room, around your house. And each one of those has a particular bearing on your health and your balance and so forth, as well as using different colors, different things that you would put or remove areas of your room. And you can look that up just easily. Just Google Feng Shui chart, Feng Shui map. Feng Shui is FENGSHUI, pronounced differently than it sounds because it's Chinese. And then last week, I brought up the idea of using the idea of sympathy, compassion, and empathy. Just do a little bit of that this morning, reviewing that, especially in light of controversy and dissension going on around the country and the world lately in the last few days and weeks. The idea of sympathy is that we see somebody in pain or in distress. And generally speaking, most of us can recognize from our past what that might be. And I say might be because we don't exactly know. When you're just observing something, especially from a distance, you don't really know what is causing the distress or what the pain might be. We can only bring up things from our past that seem similar, and then we could guess that it might be those things. So, for example, this week, or actually Friday, Saturday, the death of Fidel Castro. Now, if you were in Cuba, you would look at that happening in a different way than the people in Miami, for example. And so the people in Cuba are thinking of experiences of death of their family, death of friends, and associating that with the death of their former president. Now, the people in Miami, the folks who used to live in Cuba and then came to the United States, they are looking at that in a much different way because they don't consider the former president a friend or anything like their family. And so they can maybe sympathize that, well, there's a death and, it must be painful to somebody, but they don't quite get it in a sense, the same as the people that live in Cuba would have, or people in other countries that are in sympathy with Cuba and former leader and so forth. And then even in our own country, we would take our president-elect, his response was completely different than the current president's response. Again, because they have different outlooks of what the emotions are and what it means. So they don't really know. So there might be some sympathy there, either a lot or a little, depending on how much they can identify their experiences with the experiences of the people affected. Okay, now if we move on to empathy, it's kind of like a little degree more where you know a little bit more about the situation or the distress or the pain. So let's say you, again, we could probably use the same situation, death of the former president in Cuba. So let's say you're in Miami. Usually this is happening 90 miles away, but you probably have some relatives in Cuba. So you could contact them and say, how are you taking the death? And if they listen to the response of their relatives or friends, they'll hear views and particular emotions. And if they're just listening, they'll be able to actually feel what the friend or relatives are expressing. So if they're expressing some distress or pain, the person in Miami may very well, in fact, feel a little distress and pain. Point might be entirely different, but at least they're feeling what the other person is expressing. They're feeling an emotion. They might feel a bodily sensation, something in their stomach or chest, their arms, whatever. They'll actually feel something physical, if not mental as well. So that's getting to the idea of empathy, where you're kind of narrowing down what the distress is to their situation. And you're actually feeling the distress of the person that you're in contact with, especially if you're listening. Now, if you're not listening, or you're trying to argue or explain, there's probably, you're not really being empathetic with them, because you're not feeling what they're feeling. You're kind of expressing what you're feeling. So it might be kind of the reverse. So they would be listening to you, and then they would feel what you're feeling. But in any event, if you're not listening to the other person who's expressing their distress or pain, then you're not being empathic. A little interference in my signal, so I'm not sure if this is distorting my voice on the YouTube or not. But anyway, okay, so that's empathy. So you're questioning, you're listening. Mostly you're listening to somebody else who's feeling some pain or emotion or distress, and then you literally will feel what they're feeling. So you're kind of getting into what they're feeling. Right. The next step would be compassion, and that's and each step we go to becomes a little more difficult because of the way during our lives. So the idea of compassion is not only do you have sympathy, that you recognize there's something wrong, you don't exactly know what. You recognize the empathy, you actually feel into the person, you feel what they're feeling. One step farther in compassion. Now that you know more clearly what the distress is, or the pain, death in the family, death of your leader, ex-leader, for example, you take a step further and you do something about it. Now, compassion would probably not be to argue with the person, because you're not doing something to help alleviate the distress. So the idea of compassion is you're trying to alleviate the distress or the pain. So you're arguing with the person or even questioning them a lot would probably not lead to them over the distress. So again, you're going to be listening so that you actually feel what they're feeling. And the act of listening will actually alleviate the distress. Because if you think about it, when you have some great emotion about something, what do you want more than anything? You probably want somebody to listen to you. Literally just listen. So your listening will help alleviate their pain. And then if there is something that you could do, physically or mentally, even at a distance, you would want to do that to help alleviate the pain. So the listening is the main thing. You could, shake your head as they're talking to indicate to them you understand. You could even repeat back to them something they say. They could say, "Oh, I have such a headache over what happened yesterday," and just by repeating, "Oh, you have a headache," and they'd say, "Yeah," and then they would go on with something else. And "Yeah, I kind of felt sick to my stomach yesterday." "Oh, you were sick to your stomach too." So just by repeating, you're not only listening to them, but you're feeling what they're feeling. You're acknowledging that you heard them. So for example, say they said, "Oh, I have a headache," and you say, "Kind of sad." Well, you haven't acknowledged they have a headache, so they don't know that you really heard that. But you brought up a different subject. "Oh, you look sad." And then they would have to start thinking, "Well, gee, do I look sad?" So you kind of change the subject. So the first rule, of course, is listening. Then the second thing is just repeat back what you've heard them say. Now, you might repeat something back that isn't what they said. And then that would give them an opportunity to say, "Oh, no, I didn't mean that. I meant this." So they could reemphasize what they meant. And then you could repeat back, "Yeah, okay, now you're saying you had a headache and you had to miss work yesterday, or you had a headache, but it wasn't that bad," or whatever they say. You try to repeat back, so that acknowledge what they said, and then they have an opportunity to either acknowledge, go forward, acknowledging that they understood, or correct it. So listening, repeating back what somebody says, so you acknowledge what they say and they know that you heard them. Maybe some physical act you could do. You could send a card, you could send a gift, all kinds of different things you could do physically, if that's even possible. It's not necessarily necessary, but the idea is you're acknowledging somebody's pain, you're trying to alleviate it and not exasperate it. So you're trying to alleviate the pain, and that's the idea of compassion. And the idea of compassion is easier said than done. It's easier to do with a friend or a close friend, family member especially, because we're kind of trained to be kind to our family, to listen to our family in most cases, sometimes not always. So it's easiest to do with the family or a spouse, significant other. Then it gets a little more difficult, say your neighbor. Even love our neighbor, in quotes. We don't always have that ability to have the compassion to do that. So a neighbor might have some things that we don't agree with, or do some things we don't agree with. So we kind of have a idea of our mind that, well, we don't necessarily have to listen to our neighbor. We don't have to alleviate their pain, because after all, they're not our family member. And then you go far, and then even more difficult be somebody outside of your neighborhood, say somebody in an opposite religion, opposite political party or country. It becomes even more difficult. Uh, we're kind of set up biologically that way too, because over millions of years or thousands of years, there's wiring inside us that makes us want to be close to our family and not so much with our neighbors, not so much with the tribe next door, not so much with the country next door, and so forth. So we're kind of wired for the family. So the trick of the whole idea of compassion and empathy is to let ourselves be calm enough so that we can reflect on what people say, especially those with a different religion, philosophy, language, and so forth. So to have the calmness to be able to listen to them and reflect on what they're saying, listen to them, repeat back what they're saying, and things doing that will generally be way better than the opposite, which may want you to reflect on the possibilities of what may happen with the kind of the change of pace of our president-elect, for example. Our current president often uses the word empathy and compassion at various times, and he's done that for 8 years or so. And in his comments, if you analyze the comments made, you'll see that they're kind of like inclusive comments. There's no argument. It's kind of like you would talk to your family kind of thing. Even though there might be some big differences in philosophies or opinions, you still talk to them as if they're a friend, you listen to them and so forth. Now, our president-elect is kind of just the opposite, at least in the public statements being made. There is not so much inclusiveness anymore. It's us and you, or me and the other, us and the other folks. So it might be worth watching how that develops with the idea of will it work compared to using more compassionate language and compassionate listening. Now, a lot of people will claim that if you're too compassionate, too empathetic, you'll be taken advantage of. There's a lot of studies being done on that by social scientists lately. Well, not so much lately, in the last decade or so. And they found, in fact, that even though you might think that being kind to others, listening to others, other people will take advantage of you, which sometimes that may happen, in general, they found it is way much better to be compassionate, listening, and empathetic than not. Even though there'll be an occasional person who may take advantage of you, in general, you're way better to be a good listener and have compassionate thinking and doing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next future time. Okay, anyway, so that's just a big discussion on the idea of sympathy, going up a step to empathy, where you feel somebody's pain or distress, and then compassion, you not only recognize it and feel it, but you do something about it in a positive way to alleviate that pain or distress. Okay, so next week we'll come back again on Sunday morning at 11:30 live on YouTube and Google Hangouts, and talk some more about gaining balance in your life for emotional stability, financial stability, relationship stability, and all the above. So I'm Don Browne from About Florida, and we'll see you next time. And please check the YouTube channel out. If you like a video, do your little thumbs up thing, subscribe to the video, and that'll help out a lot. All right, see you next week.